Hello, third grade. This is Miss Glassy, and today we'll be reviewing two math concepts. Our first target for today is I can use a ruler to measure lengths to the nearest 1/4 of an inch. Our second target is I can use information from line plots to answer comparison problems. At first, these two targets might seem unrelated. But I promise third grade, very soon you'll see how measuring length and line plots are connected. Let's start by reviewing how to read a ruler to the nearest 1/4 of an inch. You can see here that I have a small part of a ruler that goes from 0 inches to just over 2 inches. I want you to remember, third grade, that each inch on a ruler is a unit. And we can break these units into smaller fractional parts. I could take this unit from 0 to 1 inches and break it into 2 equal parts by cutting it in half. I would call this part from 0 to where I split it in half 1/2, because it's half of the whole unit. If I wanted to look at the whole distance from 0 to 1, I would call this 2/2, because it is 2 of the 1/2 parts away from 0. I can break this unit into even smaller parts by splitting it now into fourths. You can see that I now have 1, 2, 3, 4 parts that I've broken my 1-inch unit into. I could call this first part 1/4 of an inch, because it's 1/4 of an inch away from 0. So I would call that first tick mark 1/4 of an inch. This second tick mark here is 1, 2 of those 1/4 parts away from 0. I could call this tick mark 2/4, and that would be correct. I could also call it 1/2 of an inch, because 1/2 and 2/4 are equivalent fractions. Typically, third grade, we call this middle mark 1/2, not 2/4, although both are correct. This next tick mark here is 1, 2, 3 of the 1/4 inch parts away from 0. So I could call this tick mark 3/4 of an inch, because it is 3 of the 1/4 tick marks away from 0. This next tick mark here, that is 1, 2, 3, 4 tick marks away from 0, is 4/4, or 1 inch. This is a pattern that we're going to see repeat again and again on a ruler. 1/4 of an inch, 1/2 of an inch, 3/4 of an inch, and then the whole inch. You can see, third grade, that there are some smaller tick marks on this ruler as well. This would break the unit into even smaller parts, but today we're not going to worry about those smallest tick marks. We're only going to be focusing on measuring to the nearest 1/4 of an inch. Let's take a look at a ruler that's slightly larger. Here's a ruler that goes from 0 to 3. We're going to go ahead and label every 1/4 tick mark on this ruler going from 0 to 3. Let's start by thinking about the whole units. You can see that there are 1, 2, 3 whole units or whole inches on this ruler. Each of these whole inches can be broken into smaller 1/4 parts. Let's start with our first unit that goes from 0 to 1. I know that I could split this unit in half, giving me 2 parts in my 1-inch unit. I can also split it in fourth, giving me 4 1/4 parts within the unit. I notice on this ruler, third grade, that the longest tick marks are the whole inch tick marks at the 0, the 1, the 2, and the 3. Then I notice, third grade, that the next longest tick mark are the half tick marks. They're just slightly smaller than those whole inch tick marks. Then, third grade, I notice that there are these next smallest tick marks. These are the 1/4 tick marks, splitting each unit into fourths. The smallest tick marks we're not going to worry about today. This is a typical pattern that you might see on a ruler, with the longest tick marks being whole inches, then the next longest half inches, next longest fourth inches, and so on. Let's go ahead and label each of the 1/4 tick marks on this ruler. The first tick mark is, of course, 0 inches. What would I call this next tick mark that is one of the 1/4 inch pieces away from 0? That's right. We would call it 1/4 of an inch. What would I call this next tick mark here? That's 2 of the 1/4 parts away from 0. We might call it 2/4. What other, more common name might we give this tick mark that's halfway between 0 and 1? That's right, we typically call this the 1/2 inch tick mark. What about this next tick mark here? That's 1, 2, 3 of the 1/4 tick marks away from 0. That's right, we would call this 3/4 of an inch. This next tick mark here is the 1 whole inch tick mark. It's easy to tell because it's labeled with a 1. Now, 3rd grade, let's look at this next unit that goes from 1 to 2 inches. Again, I can break this unit into smaller parts. I'll go ahead and highlight those 1/4 inch tick marks for us, so it's very easy for us to see. When I want to start thinking about what each of these tick marks represent, I start by thinking how many whole units away from 0 are each of these tick marks. Well, this tick mark here is 1 whole inch away from 0, plus a little bit more. It's 1 more of those 1/4 tick marks away from 0. So I would say that this is 1 and 1/4 of an inch. Look at this next tick mark here. Think, how many whole tick marks is it away from 0? How many of those 1/4 inch tick marks is it away from the last whole unit? Yes, you could say that it's 1 and 2/4 of an inch, but you know that we would really call it 1 and 1/2 of an inch, although both are correct. Look at this next tick mark and think, how many whole units is it away from 0? How many whole inches, I should say, is it away from 0? How many of those 1/4 of an inch is it past the last whole 1 inch unit? That's right, it's 1 whole inch away from 0 plus 1, 2, 3 of those 1/4 parts. So we would say that it is 1 whole inch and 3/4 of an inch, or 1 3/4 inches. This next tick mark is 2 whole inches away from 0. It's easy to tell because it's labeled. Now, 3rd grade, we're going to turn our attention to this next unit from 2 to 3. Again, we're going to start by thinking how many whole units is the tick mark away from 0. Then, how many fourths of an inch is it away from the last whole unit? Let's start with this tick mark. That's what length does this represent? Think, how many whole inches is it away from 0? How many 1/4 parts is it away from the last whole unit? That's right, it is 2 and 1/4 of an inch. What about this next tick mark? How many whole inches is it away from 0? How many 1/4 parts is it after the last whole unit? That's right, it is 2 and 1/2 of an inch. You could also call it 2 and 2/4 of an inch, but we would typically call it 2 1/2 inches. What is this tick mark here? How many whole inches is it away from 0? How many 1/4 inches is it after the last whole unit? That's right, it is 2 3/4 of an inch. And finally, this last tick mark is 3 whole inches. It's easy to tell because it's labeled. 3rd grade, I want you to notice the pattern you see on this ruler. First, we have a whole inch, like 0 whole inches. Then we have 0 and 1/4 of an inch, 0 and 1/2 of an inch, 0 and 3/4 of an inch, 1 whole inch. Then we have 1 whole inch and 1/4 of an inch, 1 inch, 1 and 1/2 inches, 1 and 3/4 inches, 2 whole inches. The pattern repeats. 2 and 1/4 whole inches, 2 and 1/2 inches, 2 and 3/4 inches, 3 whole inches. This pattern would continue on again and again, no matter how long your ruler is. Now that we've reviewed how to read rulers to the nearest 1/4 of an inch, let's go ahead and do some measuring. You can see I have a blue bar that I'm ready to measure. I have carefully lined up this blue bar so that the end of the blue bar lines up to the 0 on the ruler. The end of my ruler is not where 0 is at, so I did not line up the end of my bar with the end of the ruler. I lined it up with 0. We always start measuring at 0. Now, to measure this, I need to think, how far away from 0 is the other end of this item? How many whole inches is it away from 0? Well, I see it's 2 whole inches away from 0. It doesn't make it to 3 inches, but it goes quite a bit past 2. Now I can think about those 1/4 of an inch. Remember, the 1/4 of an inch are these tick marks. We ignore those little tiny ones. How many 1/4 of an inch is it past 2 whole inches? 1, 2, 3 of those 1/4 tick marks. That means, 3rd grade, that this blue bar is 2 and 3/4 inches long. Excellent. Let's look at another example. Look at this pencil. Think, how long is this pencil from 0 all the way to, from the eraser at 0 all the way to the point here? Take a moment and think. How many whole inches is the pencil away from 0? How many 1/4 of an inch away from 0 is it? Pause the video and determine the length of this pencil. Press play when you're ready to check. I'm sure that you noticed this pencil is 1, 2, 3, 4 whole inches away from 0, plus another 1/4 of an inch. So we would say that this pencil is 4 and 1/4 inches long. Good measuring, 3rd grade. Let's do another one. Look at the small purple bar. Think, how many whole inches away from 0 is the purple bar? How many 1/4 of an inch is it past the last whole inch? Pause the video and determine the length of the purple bar. Press play when you're ready to check. I'm sure that you noticed this purple bar doesn't even go 1 whole inch past 0. So I have to start right away thinking about how many 1/4 of an inch past 0 it is. I can see that this purple bar is only one of the 1/4 inch pieces away from 0. So that means that the purple bar is 1/4 of an inch long. Very good. Let's try another. Measure the piece of candy. Think, how many whole inches is it past 0? How many 1/4 inch pieces is it past the last whole inch? Pause the video and find the length of the piece of candy. Press play when you're ready to check. You might have said that this piece of candy is 2 and 2/4 inches long. That is correct, but remember, we would typically write that as 2 and 1/2 inches long. 1/2 and 2/4 are equivalent. Let's do one more practice problem together. Go ahead and measure the length of this green bar. Think, how many whole inches is it past 0? How many 1/4 of an inch pieces is it past the last whole inch? Pause the video and find the length of the green bar. Press play when you're ready to check. I'm sure you found that this green bar is 3 and 3/4 inches long. Great measuring, 3rd grade. Now we're ready to review line plots. You might be thinking to yourself, what do line plots have to do with measuring? Why would we review measuring length to the nearest 1/4 of an inch in the same day we're reviewing line plots? That's a great question that you as a mathematician have asked yourself. Oftentimes, we use data about measuring length to the nearest 1/4 of an inch in our line plots. Data that has been gathered by measuring things is used in our line plots. so we review them together. Line plots represent data using a number line. Line plots show the frequency of each value, or how often each value occurred. Line plots are used to represent numerical data. You would not see items on a line plot with categories, like favorite flavors of ice cream or who your third grade teacher was. Instead, you'll see data represented where the categories are numbers, lengths of things, how many of items some people have, things like that. Information from reading line plots can be used to answer mathematical problems. So, let's go ahead and look at this line plot. Great mathematicians always start by reading and understanding the information in a line plot. So that's what we will do. We'll read and understand this line plot. I can see that the title of this line plot is Length of Third Graders' Feet. So I know that this line plot will be about how long third graders' feet are. I can see that each of the categories at the bottom, from 7 1/2 to 10, are all lengths in inches. These are lengths of third graders' feet, measured in inches. I also notice there's a key that tells me that each X represents one third grader's foot. So, I'm ready to read and understand this graph. How many students had 7 1/2 inch long feet? Well, I see that there are 2 X's above 7 1/2. That tells me that 2 third graders had 7 1/2 inch long feet. How many third graders had 7 3/4 inch long feet? 1, 2, 3. There are 3 X's above the category 7 3/4. So I can see that 7 3/4, that there were 3 students with 7 3/4 inch long feet. How many students had 8 inch long feet? Count the X's above 8 inches and tell me how many students had 8 inch long feet. Yes, 6 students had 8 inch long feet. What about 8 1/4 inch long feet? How many students had feet that were that long? Yes, 1 student had 8 1/4 inch long feet. What about 8 1/2 inch long feet? How many students had 8 1/2 inch long feet? Count the X's above 8 1/2 inches long to see how many students had a foot that was that long. Yes, 4 students had 8 1/2 inch long feet. Now, when I look at 8 3/4 of an inch, I see that there are no X's above it. That means that no students had a foot that was 8 3/4 inches long. So I'll put a 0 there. No students had a foot that long. How many students had a 9 inch foot? Yes, 6 students had a 9 inch foot. How many students had a foot that was 9 1/4 inches long? Yes, 2 students had a 9 1/4 inch long foot. How many students had a 9 1/2 inch long foot? Yes, 0 students had a 9 1/2 inch long foot. We know because there are no X's above 9 1/2 inches. What about 9 3/4 inches? How many students had a foot that long? Again, 0, because there are no X's above 9 3/4 of an inch. And finally, 10 inches. How many students had a foot 10 inches long? Yes, 1 student had a foot that was 10 inches long. Third grade, great job reading this this line plot with me. Goodness. I know that at first it seems a little bit silly to go through and read each line or like it's taking a long time, but good mathematicians are always careful and read and understand the whole line plot before they begin any of the questions. Now that we've done such a nice job understanding this same line plot right here, third grade, we're ready to answer some questions about it. Again, this is the same line plot that we were just talking about with the length of third graders' feet. Let's take a look at the first question here. What is the most common foot length? What was the least common foot length? I see that this first question is actually 2 questions. I need to tell what was the most common foot length and what was the least common foot length. Remember, the most common foot length is going to have the most X's above it because the most kids had it, so it's most common. The least common foot length will have the least x's above it, because the least common is the one with the fewest students. Go ahead and look at the line plot. What was the most common foot length? What length had the most x's above it? What length has the most students? I noticed that there are two that have the most. Two lengths have six x's above them, so they have 6 students each. Those two lengths are 8 inches and 9 inches. So my answer would be that the most common foot lengths were 8 and 9 inches. You can have two lengths be most common if that's what the graph shows. Notice that I wrote my answer in a complete sentence. I restated the question, what was the most common foot length, and I used a capital letter and a period. When you are answering your questions, you need to write in a complete sentence, restating the question with a capital and a period. Now, I almost forgot that there was a second question. What was the least common foot length? Thankfully, I double-checked and remembered. The least common foot length has the least number of x's over it. You're probably noticing, just like me, that there are actually 3 least common foot lengths. 8 3/4 of an inch, 9 1/2 inch, and 9 3/4 of an inch all don't have any x's over them, so they're all least common. No students had feet that long. So my answer would sound like the least common foot lengths were 8 3/4 inches, 9 1/2 inches, and 9 3/4 inches. Great job, 3rd grade. Let's look at our next question. How many more students had a 9-inch long foot than a 9 1/4 inch long foot? I know that this is a compare question because I'm seeing the compare words, how many more. So I'm going to compare the number of students with a 9-inch long foot to the number of students with a 9 1/2 inch long foot. I'll subtract the greater amount minus the lesser amount. Well, a 9-inch long foot, let's see here. Oh, 6 students had a 9-inch long foot. And a 9 1/4 inch long foot, well, only 2 students had a foot that long. So I'll subtract 6 minus 2. 6 minus 2, easy peasy, equals 4. Think in your brain, what would our answer in a complete sentence sound like? Actually say it out loud to me. I'll give you a moment. I'll bet that your answer sounds a lot like this. 4 more students had a 9-inch long foot than a 9 1/4 inch long foot. Great job, 3rd grade. Let's look at 2 more questions. Look at question number 3 with me. How many total students measured their feet? Oh, when it's asking me how many total students, I know that this is a put together problem where I need to put together all of the students on the whole graph. There's 2 ways that I could do this, 3rd grade. I could add up each of the amount of each value, 2 plus 3 plus 6 plus 1 plus 4 plus 6 plus 2 plus 1, or I could count all of the x's on the entire line plot. Because remember, I want to know all of the students. Go ahead, 3rd grade, and pause the video and find the total number of students that measured their feet, either by adding or counting. You could even do both to double check. Press play when you're ready to check your answer. Excellent, 3rd grade. Before I tell you the answer, I want you to say the answer out loud to me in a complete sentence, restating the question. Go ahead and do it out loud. I'll bet that your answer sounded almost exactly like this. 25 total students measured their feet. Awesome job, 3rd grade. Let's look at the last question, question number 4. How many 3rd graders had a foot that was 9 inches or longer? Now, when it asked me how many students had a foot that was 9 inches or longer, I know that I need to think about all of the lengths that are 9 inches or more. So 7 1/2 inches, I'm not going to think about kids who had that foot length because that's less than 9. I'm going to go all the way to my 9-inch foot length, and I'm going to think about all the lengths that are 9 inches or more. So that would be 9 inches, 9 1/4 inches, 9 1/2 inches, 9 3/4 inches, and 10 inches. I'm going to think about all the students who had a foot that are any of those lengths, and I need to add them up. Just like for that last problem, we can either add the 6 plus the 2 plus the 1, or we could just count all of the x's. Pause the video and find how many students had a foot that was 9 inches or longer. Press play when you're ready to check. Before we check this last question, 3rd grade, I want you to say the answer to me out loud in a complete sentence, restating the question. Go ahead and do it. I can't wait to hear. I bet it sounded a lot like this. 9 third graders had a foot that was 9 inches or longer. Third grade, thank you for doing this line plot and measuring practice with me. You're now ready to show me what you remember on our assignment. Great job, third grade.